The paints that we use are our own custom mix of Genesis paints. We have them in pre-mixed colors so that you don't have to mix the colors yourself. The first color that we'll be using here is Vein Blue. And you just need a very small amount. All of these paints, we're going to be working with them very thin, watery like consistency. I'm going to be using this odorless brush cleaner and thinner. We also have a thinner that comes with the Genesis paints. That's a little thicker, but in order to get the fine detail, I prefer using the liquid. And for the veins, we're going to be using a number 1 liner brush. And I like to wipe the excess paint off my brush so I don't have too much on my brush here. And these are just kind of random. I like to start down near the temple and then up and make V shapes. And you want to take the ends and dab them with a cosmetic wedge to blend them in. And this is a little bit light. We could go a little bit darker. I'm going to add a little bit more paint. I like to start down in the middle of the forehead somewhere and do some things. If they are dark, you can dab them out with your cosmetic wedge, using a different area of the wedge each time so you don't smear them. About like that. And this is pretty random. You can, doesn't really matter exactly where they are. The veins can come up anywhere across the temples of the forehead. Okay, and now I'm going to paint inside of the head, behind the eyes, nose, and mouth to add a little depth with the blue paint. This will look a little bit like veins from the outside when we're done here. And you just want to get in the areas where you can see that the vinyl is thinner, around the eyes, in the corners of the mouth, and around the sides of the nose. Now we're going to do the veining on the limbs. It's basically the same idea as we did with the head. I like to do some on the front of the foot. You can do kind of Y-shaped patterns or just little lines, kind of vary it. Now after we've done both legs, we'll go ahead and move on to the hands. And sometimes when we're doing the veins, we'll get a little bit of the blue paint running down into a crease. If that happens, you can just take a toothpick and work that out. I also like to do a few fine veins on the hand. The next step is the baby skin. We're going to be applying this over the entire head and limbs. And then you add the thinner, and this needs to be a really thin, milky like consistency. I'm going to go ahead and add a little more thinner to get it even thinner here. Then we're going to use a natural sea sponge. This gives a really nice lifelike skin texture to your doll. And what you want to do is just slightly roll that in the paint. And then you just kind of roll it on the doll. You want to be really careful not to rub or make stroke marks. So you just kind of roll and lift. And that's given us a very fine skin-like texture. You can see if you come in close, there's almost a pin dot look of a lighter flesh tone there. And you want to cover the entire face and the back of the head. We'll be covering all of the vinyl in this step. And this should just show up very lightly. If it looks too white, you need to thin your paint down a bit more. And if you can't see it at all, then you need to add a little more paint. Now this sponge won't get down into all the little creases on the vinyl. So when we've finished covering the entire head, I like to come back with a Maxine's mop brush and fill in the little areas that we've missed. You want to dab the excess paint off. And you just dab lightly into the creases, and this will give a similar effect to what the sponge gave us. And if there's any areas where the paint's a little too thick, you can use your brush to blend those in. Or you can use a cosmetic wedge with a little bit of your thinner on it to dab excess paint off if you've got more than what the brush will blend in for you. You want to get behind the ears and in all the creases. And I've got some paint, a little bit of excess paint that ran here, so I'm just gonna use my brush to blot those out. And then we're gonna go ahead and let the thinner evaporate, and we'll do the same thing to the arms and the legs. I like to mix my paint before I move on because it tends to separate a bit and get thicker in areas. And occasionally you'll need to add a little bit more thinner to keep the same consistency that you started with. Then we're going to use the same process of lightly rolling the sponge onto the vinyl. And I'm not quite getting enough paint on there. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit. You want to make sure you can see the little white dots and texture that this forms, but you don't want it to be overdone. It's a really subtle look that you're trying to achieve. And with the fingers, it's difficult to get the sponge in all the creases and spaces in between, so we're going to go ahead and finish those with our mop brush. Now we're going to go ahead and do this to all of the limbs, and this will complete the first patina. Once the pieces are painted with the first layer, it's a good idea to place them on a rack so that the thinner can evaporate. And once the thinner has evaporated like it has on this head here, you'll notice that the skin layer shows up a lot more and it looks a bit chalky. And in order to fix that before we bake it, I just like to take it and rub lightly. You don't want to rub too hard, but you kind of buff the paint so that you can blend in any spots where it looks too white or too chalky. But you don't want to rub so hard that you lose the skin texture that we've put in there. And if there's any creases that have excess of the lighter skin color, you can use one of these pointed Q-tips to remove any of the excess paint. Now that the head and limbs have all been finished and buffed, we're going to put these in the oven for 8 to 10 minutes, and we'll bake it between 260 and 265 degrees.
Great, you got it. When we put this in the oven, we're going to do the exact same thing we do with any of the vinyls that we work with or any of the polymer clays we work with. The important thing is that none of the pieces touch the other pieces as they go in the tray. So they won't have the option of rolling around or touching one another. If they touch, they're going to have a tendency to blot the paint, and we don't want that to happen. So we'll just lay them in. And putting them on prop is a good idea. If you have prop is the silicone prop that's made for the ovens. If you don't, just a regular polyfill will work. But in a nice little pan that will withstand the temperature. Now the temperature we're going in with is only 265 degrees. But we want to make certain that we use a thermometer. Thermometers are so important because anytime we're working with anything that's going in the oven, in the way of polymers or vinyls or paints, we want to make sure we don't exceed the temperature that's recommended by the manufacturer. In this case, it's 265 for 8 minutes. I like to put the thermometer where you can see it from the outside of the oven and then monitor it as you're working. Again, let's make certain we don't exceed 265. 265, 8 minutes, and we'll have a properly cured head.
Now that the parts are properly cured, we're going to continue on with the next step. This next step is an optional step. We're going to open the nose. You can shade the nose. I prefer to open the nose, and we do this with a Dremel tool and a drill bit. And on selecting your size for the drill bit, you want to find a bit that will fit into the nostril, and you can rotate it without it hitting the vinyl so that it moves freely. And when you found the correct size, you set that into your tool. And when using the drill, you'll want to make sure that you wear your safety goggles. I like to turn on the drill and make sure that the bit is rotating straight. And I put it on the kind of medium-low speed. And then very carefully line the drill bit up with the nostril and go straight in. And I kind of like to move it back and forth a little bit. That gets rid of some of the excess pieces of vinyl. And then move it out. And very carefully do the other side. Now that we've opened the nose, we're going to use a round needle file to clean the little excess pieces of vinyl that are left. It's a good idea with a new needle file to wipe off any excess manufacturing grease that might be on the file before you start. And then you just place the file into the nostril and twist it. To file off the excess vinyl. Like that.